spent most of last week in Washington, D.C. at a media conference with more than 100 of the most thoughtful journalists and editors in America. We were planning ways to collaborate in order to protect the most oppressed communities from the goons running our government. And while I planned on writing all about the actions we are taking in the coming weeks and months to expose lies and uphold democracy, I had some other observations right before leaving the Capitol that I felt took precedent in these cold and dark days. The journalism shop talk can wait. Though my time in D.C. was primarily consumed by workshops, on Saturday I finally got out to do some sightseeing, my first stop being the National Museum of the American Indian. It's an extraordinary space, top to bottom a reminder of the strength and ingenuity of Native Americans, as well as of the horrors that so many faced as European colonizers shot and slashed their way across the continent. Not to mention the terror that many still face. As I toured a section dedicated to the Lakota people, indigenous to Great Plains territories, including the Standing Rock Reservation, which faces the threat of encroaching pipelines, I wondered if President Donald Trump, so hell-bent on just handing the Dakotas over to big oil, has visited these difficult exhibits, or at least considered all the nightmares that white immigrants have caused over the past several centuries. But of course he hasn't, because the POTUS, like his supporters, is an emotional and intellectual Neanderthal. Since entering the White House, his administration has made every move imaginable to block and suspend the rights of those that they are afraid of. In virtually every case, pure basis of bigoted concern. All of which leads to my next big question, which is whether Trump has seen the 1905 letter that his grandfather, Frederick Trump, wrote begging not to be deported from Germany. Unearthed by a German tabloid late last month, it serves as a reminder that, to quote old Frederick, deportation is very, very hard for a family. Perhaps if President Trump had some sense of history, either his own family's or that of the innumerable others that comprise our vast national tapestry, then he would understand and ideally be ashamed of his white nationalist inclinations. Until then, it's up to everybody else, namely decent people, to fight on behalf of humanity, especially as Trump threatens to defund sanctuary cities and to gut communities through deportation, among other heinous means. For this installment of Beyond Boston, in which we showcase the best of community media news around the region, we're going to take a close and compassionate look at Civic Sanctuary, starting with this critical explainer from the Lowell Telecommunications Corporation.
On January 25th, the non-partisan group Lowell Votes produced a timely and informative program in the LTC studio on sanctuary cities. The panel discussed President Trump's new executive order to restrict immigration and withhold federal funds from cities that do not assist ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with their operations. Dr. Seo Kim, a UMass Lowell professor and community activist, first explained the terms trust ordinance and sanctuary city.
Usually, most specifically, what people are talking about is a kind of trust act or trust ordinance, which is what Lawrence has. And what this says specifically is that local law enforcement will not ask immigration status, voluntarily enforce federal immigration law. Basically, as Lowell Police Chief Bill Taylor has said, that they will not become sort of ICE officials, de facto ICE officials. But this is a specific legal definition. There are also cities like San Francisco that have made a larger sort of not just legal but also ethical and moral statement that we will stand by all members of our community, documented, undocumented, any vulnerable refugees. And so, for example, San Francisco has self-identified not just as a trust act city, but as a sanctuary city, as this larger sort of, again, moral, ethical entity. In terms of the federal government, for the current president, there is no distinction. I mean, he sees the trust act cities as sanctuary cities, and when he talks about pulling federal funding from these cities, he's talking about those trust act cities.
Lowell has a long history of welcoming refugees and immigrants from the 1800s to today.
The concept of sanctuary really becomes alive during the Fugitive Slave Act, when Lowell identified itself as part of the Underground Railroad, as providing sanctuary for runaway slaves against the threat of prosecution by the government. Lowell did not give up any of its fugitive slaves, right? It provided sanctuary.
Lowell has not declared itself a sanctuary city or passed a trust ordinance as Lawrence and several other Massachusetts cities have. But according to Police Superintendent Taylor, the police do not question the immigration status of people they encounter. The show covered a lot more related topics. You can watch the entire hour-long program on LTC Channel 8 or online at ltc.org/watch.
Let's face it, we all make jokes about lawyers. But as anyone who's ever needed one knows, there are also many ethical attorneys you can count on. Amy Grunder, a lawyer with Mira, the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, is one of them. We asked Amy to come on Beyond Boston and speak about some policy updates, as well as her organization's efforts on the ground and with community building. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Chris.
Cool. So, we're talking about sanctuary in general. So, I mean, let's start before the Trump administration, maybe. I mean, can you tell us what Mira does? Clearly, everything wasn't perfect, and I've spoken with advocates for Mira for years about different issues. So, what was not necessarily the day-to-day, but what were the priorities, or for the years leading up to this?
Well, we've always supported comprehensive immigration reform, and of course that's been deadlocked in Congress for a really long time. So we supported, well, as you know, the Obama administration has kind of a mixed record on immigration. On the one hand, really progressive policies like the policies for Dreamers, the deferred action for childhood arrivals that allowed kids who were brought here people who have been brought here as children to have temporary legal status while they're here, and on the other hand, introducing the Secure Communities program, which invited local police to hold people for immigration violations. And that we had major problems with. But that's on the federal level. And then on this, I'm Director of Legislative Affairs. I mainly focus on state level work, so both state legislation and state policy. And one of the things we do, so we're a coalition. We have 130 organizational members that we need to keep informed about state and federal policies coming down the pike, and also ways to advocate to change them or improve them or advocate for new policies. And on the state level, we've always supported kind of a raft of legislation that positively impacts immigrants on the one hand, and then on the other hand, annually defending Massachusetts immigrants from legislation and budget riders that attempt to cut them out of various programs that they're entitled to be.
Which probably aren't always so evident to the public, right?
No, a lot of this, I don't think people really pay attention to what happens in the state legislature that much, because we sort of assume that, well, Massachusetts is, a Democratic majority state, and we have a progressive congressional delegation, and people aren't really watching the state legislature so much. But and we have really great members of the state legislature, but it's an annual fight every year to make sure that it's a defensive game a lot of the time.
So let's start at the municipal level for a second. What does sanctuary mean? We're in Somerville right now. Yeah. We're filming in Somerville today. There's a lot of definitions floating out there. Do we have to officially call it a sanctuary city? I know we can't answer everything, but what do people need to know? What are some of the important things about sanctuary and how they've been carried out in Massachusetts?
Okay, so sanctuary city is not a legal term, it's a political term. So when it's used by faith-based communities, for example, they're talking about sanctuary policies, which might include anything from offering support to families targeted to deportation, the family members, or putting funds together to assist people in deportation proceedings, all the way up to offering a place to live for people who are targeted or are being sought by ICE, which is at the other end of the spectrum, which can include civil disobedience. So that's where the sanctuary city term comes from. It comes from a faith-based movement in the 1980s. That's the way they refer to the term. So it always depends on who's using the phrase, right? So when the Trump administration talks about sanctuary cities, or opponents talk about sanctuary cities, what they're talking about is jurisdictions that in one way or another limit police participation in civil immigration enforcement, like Somerville, for example. And there's lots of different ways that state and local governments can do that, so it doesn't mean anything specific, right? So We prefer to call these jurisdictions trust jurisdictions or safe communities jurisdictions and that sort of thing, because there's sort of a range of specific policies that state and local governments can put into place.
Now, how do the best of those policies kind of jibe with the work that Mira does, and how do they enforce the same things, and how do they help those communities, which are, I presume, communities that you're helping?
Well, the idea is you don't want local police to be involved in immigration enforcement, because when police are involved in immigration enforcement, it means that people in immigrant communities are unwilling to come forward to report crimes. If they're victims of crimes, if they're witnesses to crimes, they're unwilling to assist in police investigations. And there's already there's research out there. A study just came out recently saying that communities that have these policies in place are actually safer than comparable communities that don't.
Imagine that.
So imagine that. So the idea, I mean, just think about it for a second. Just in Massachusetts alone, if you are an immigrant, you're twice as likely to die of domestic homicide if you're an immigrant than if you're a native-born resident of Massachusetts, right? And that's because people are easily victimized. If they're afraid to go to the police, their victimizers know it too.
Take the authorities out of the equation.
Right.
Now, as you noted, a big part of what you do is informing a number of organizations in the coalition as to what's coming up next, what's happening, and this is not even day to day. I mean, as we sit here right now, we're waiting on so-called, I can't call them reforms, new policies, but it's minute to minute, touch and go. If you could just tell us, like, how do people? There are people probably watching this who want to keep up themselves. What's the best way for people to keep up with these things that really affect people in dramatic ways?
On the local level, we've been approached by, I would say, at least a dozen state and local groups that are trying to pass similar policies in what I would call safe communities policies in their local communities to limit police interaction with ICE. Basically what this does is it means that police aren't participating in civil immigration enforcement, right? So if police have a reason to hold someone to prosecute or investigate a crime, that's one thing. But otherwise, it puts citizens and non-citizens on a level playing field. And that's the kind of policies we want to see. There's also, so people can support those kinds of policies in their own communities. That's number one. Number two, there's statewide legislation before the state legislature now called the Safe Communities Act. And that was introduced by Senator Jamie Eldridge in the Senate and Representative of Acton and Representative Juana Matias of Lawrence. And that bill would protect the civil rights and safety of all Massachusetts residents by making sure that state and local resources aren't used to separate families in Massachusetts or to create a Muslim registry, and creates due process protections for people who are in immigration detention as well.
Well, I was just going to thank you for coming on, but thanks for bringing some positive news as well, I guess, for the time being. Shout out to Senator Eldridge, as always. And now we have a clip from CCTV in Cambridge about Sanctuary, followed by an interview with Malden Mayor Gary Christensen from MATV in that city, as well as SCATV footage from Somerville's recent Sanctuary City rally with more than 4,000 attendees, and of course, closing remarks from BINJ Network Director Jason Pramas.
America, home to many cultures and known as the land of opportunities. For generations, many strive to come here, however, they still struggle to reach a point of success.
Unfortunately, if you are a doctor and an engineer back in your country, it's very difficult to do it, to be a doctor and engineer here.
I think it's highly unfortunate that educated individuals come from another country and can't utilize their education as much to benefit the U.S. economy. I believe that's a lot of also recognition. Are you from a certified university? Do we accept the education you have? Which is, it's kind of unfair for a lot of people coming in who hold high degrees, but it's also viable because you're not sure what type of education they received.
El sueño americano es como venir a hacer lo que no puedes hacer en tu país, crecer sin limitarte, porque aquí la gente es un poco más abierta y tienes, como lo mencioné antes, más oportunidades.
I have always worked with immigrants and refugees. First, I did it with adults, Then I work with children, and now I'm working with immigrant high school students. And I love what I do. I am very passionate about, and that's my American dream. My personal definition is being able to take advantage of opportunities that are given to you, but also to not forget those you left behind, and to work for the well-being of the community. That's my definition of the American dream.
En América tienes un poco más de oportunidades, hay más cultura, la gente es un poco más abierta. En otros países batallas un poco más, pero no estoy peleado con ir a otros países.
So you have to kind of like overcome, you know, that people discriminate against you, that you don't speak English, that people may not respect you for who you are because you have to prove yourself.
People trying to transition into the United States via that route, it's very hard because, you know, I've worked at like fast food restaurants and stuff and like met people who had like a master's degree in economics, and I was just like, I'm going for my undergrad degree in economics. Let's hope I can secure a better position than this. But, you know, the struggle is very real and apparent for lots of immigrants.
You know, I was doing the cleaning job and the factory job, and I did that for a couple of years. Then when I realized that I was not gonna go back to El Salvador, I decided to go to night school first. So I had to quit my evening job, my cleaning job, to go and learn English. So I was working full-time, I was raising my son, and I was going full-time to school. And sometimes I felt like giving up because it was just too much. But, you know, I had to sort of think about the future and what was ahead. I feel that there is always a light at the end of the tunnel.
El que quiere llegar a trabajar en algo y ser alguien simplemente tiene que echarle ganas, tiene que ponerle todo su empeño, y no siento que es algo que estorbe. Por lo general, la gente que emigra tiene trabajos muy básicos como meseros o en restaurantes. Es muy poca la gente que emigra y llega a tener un puesto muy grande. Que pasa, es muy bueno, ¿no? Pero siento que somos personas y tenemos la misma oportunidad.
Is how does the city of Malden distinguish themselves from cities that identify as a sanctuary city?
Well, first, I think the Chief and I want to thank you for taking an interest in such an important topic, and to all your colleagues at Malden Access Television for what you're doing to help bring the news to our residents and businesses. I think for the Chief and I, this is something that we have discussed for a long time, and I think based on the climate and welcoming environment here in Malden, we just never thought we needed to be designated.
How would your administration address a notice of removal or request for the Malden PD to detain an undocumented resident from a mixed status family living here in Malden, Massachusetts?
Okay, so just to be clear, so when you say a mixed status family, that would be a combination of people who are here legally and someone whose status is in question. Yeah, that would be a very emotional environment. Any situation that the police are in which there is some separation occurring between a strong family unit, clearly there are emotional components to that.
How would you address repairing the breach following such an occurrence? For an example, the biggest issue that a lot of chief of police around the state of Massachusetts, perhaps across the United States, are speaking of the ability to cohere with the community when it comes to being able to trust the police.
Yes.
Following something of that the term sanctuary city, although perhaps a title without a distinction,
Right,
could reassure its residents in participating with the police force in providing information that could be crucial to criminal actions that could be more pertinent to residents in terms of, say, crime violent crimes in particular.
I think there are so many broad perspectives on it, because I've actually had this conversation with people when they say, oh, they were in favor of a sanctuary city, and then I would throw a scenario at them. So I said, well, so what would you want your police department to do if they had a person in custody for a violent crime and knew that there was an issue regarding their status, and had a non-cooperation agreement with an agency, and released that person back into society, and then they went on to murder someone? Which there is an example of that. It's real and true, not here, thankfully. So when someone hears that, to their credit, many of them reassess what they mean by a sanctuary city. So I would rather let the trust manifest itself in legitimate forms of everyday life. If someone will walk into my police station and make a report, I think what's helpful, and I appreciate this opportunity, is to understand that local municipal police agencies, when you interact with them, do not ask you for your passport. They do not ask you how long have you been here. They do not have the right under the Fourth Amendment to just walk up to any person who is walking down the street or going about their daily existence in violation of no laws and require them to supply identification information. That's always been the case. So we have to strike a delicate balance, obviously, with our sworn mission to uphold the law and the Constitution, and to maintain legitimate relationships with other members of law enforcement who are also going about their job within the context of the law and the Constitution. I would be naive to say that all law enforcement action does not have a detrimental effect on innocent people. If we were to arrest a person right now for a crime, and that person was a father, a husband, or a son, and they went to jail, forgetting the immigration issue, there is a family now that has a void in their life and an absence. There's a consequence to that.
And as mayor, I couldn't be prouder to be part of this city. My family told me growing up, hey, listen, the point of all this is to share each other's cultures and grow from it. And 30, 40 years later, here I am doing exactly that. There are things that I have experienced, thanks to the wonderful diversity here in our city, that I'm certain I otherwise never would. And so, again, I just want to join with the chief just to say what an honor and privilege it is to be serving the people of Malden.
Thank you, Chief Mullis. Thank you, Mayor Gary Christensen.
Sure.
And with Neighborhood View, I'm Guillermo Hamlin.
Saturday, February 4th. Braving the cold, thousands of residents assembled in front of Somerville High School to rally in support of Somerville's sanctuary status. The rally was called in response to President Trump's executive order to strip federal funding from sanctuary cities. Somerville has been a sanctuary city for 30 years, and according to city officials, it plans to remain that way in perpetuity.
We will not abandon our values of inclusivity, diversity, and equality. Today, we're here to celebrate and support our sanctuary city status.
I'm a Somerville resident I've lived in the area for about 11 years. Our mayor has done a wonderful job of making himself visible nationally and by going against the grain, and I feel like that's what we need to keep doing. We need to keep speaking out.
Let today's event exclaim to the rest of the country and the world, we know what makes America great. We know what values work. We are never, ever going to run away from who we are. God bless you all. Be safe. Thank you very much.
For Somerville Neighborhood News, this is Peter Levine.
Immigration enforcement is the responsibility of the federal government. Yet Immigration and Customs Enforcement and related federal agencies often rely on local police to help round up undocumented immigrants for deportation. That problematic lies at the heart of the rising sanctuary cities movement. Local governments in opposition to increasingly inhumane federal immigration policy under the Trump administration are passing resolutions ordering police forces under their control to refuse to aid federal agencies seeking to detain and deport undocumented immigrants. Immigrant advocates hope that creating large numbers of such sanctuary cities, plus sanctuary campuses and sanctuary religious institutions, will stop or at least slow the latest wave of deportations until the U.S. finally develops a more fair and rational immigration policy. That's not going to happen without popular support, and all too many Americans have not been provided with the information that will allow them to make an informed decision on the matter. Citizens who back slowing or stopping immigration do so because they believe immigrants steal jobs from Americans, don't pay taxes, and/or increase crime, positions that are not borne out by major research studies. But if they look more closely at what has actually happened on the immigration front since the early 1990s, there's every possibility that they would join a groundswell of support for progressive immigration policy. And for something else besides, support for strong labor legislation at the national and international levels. So it's imperative that nativist Americans begin to understand the structural crisis that led to the current situation. The biggest precipitating factor was a so-called trade treaty signed in 1994 by President Bill Clinton called the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, as it was known, was the result of a major lobbying effort by American multinational corporations with support from CEOs in Canada and Mexico. It was sold to Congress as a remedy to the supposed dilemma of migration from Mexico and points south to the U.S. The argument was that by eliminating barriers to trade like tariffs and taxes on major corporations, profits would rise, the economic boats of all three countries would be lifted, more good jobs would be produced, and immigration would slow to a trickle, because there would be no reason for anyone to leave home. As often happens in politics, this turned out to be a pack of lies. Removing the so-called trade barriers meant that U.S. multinationals were able to flood the Mexican market with cheap goods and services. Goods and services that Mexicans had once produced for themselves, either in Mexican-owned companies or in a robust public sector that included a strong nationalized oil industry. The Mexican economy went into immediate freefall, throwing over 1 million people out of work. Then the American multinationals were able to move more manufacturing operations to Mexico than ever before, where they were free of pesky labor unions and tax burdens, resulting in the loss of over 682,000 good American jobs by 2010, according to the Economic Policy Institute. Corporations that kept major factories and farms in the U.S. were free to take advantage of a seemingly endless flood of undocumented immigrant labor that are rarely able to organize into labor unions, since one call to the feds ensures the deportation of any troublemakers. Canada was also badly hurt by NAFTA. Billionaire CEOs got even richer and extended their political power significantly in all three countries. And here's the irony. It is precisely those Americans who lost their jobs to NAFTA and other neoliberal schemes like it that voted for Donald Trump in significant enough numbers in key states to ensure his victory. That's why any successful movement for immigration justice must be linked directly to the most far-sighted sectors of the labor movement in the U.S. and abroad. The key to ending the fighting over immigration is to enshrine strong labor rights worldwide, so that major corporations will no longer be able to pit workers in the U.S. against workers in other countries in what's been aptly called a race to the bottom. Spread that message widely enough, and the nativist movement will evaporate, aside from a small core of outright racists. Because if workers can make a decent living wherever they live, then immigration will cease to be an issue anywhere. And when people do migrate to the future U.S. once a fair immigration regime is finally in place, it will be much easier to do so legally and permanently. Which is the kind of world we all want, yes? One in which the rights of human beings to a decent living and to move about the planet freely are respected more than the rights of corporations to maximize their profits. For Beyond Boston, I'm Jason Pramas.